Institute for Advanced Study. We started with Professor Mphahlele. We spent almost 10 days here. He had come to launch his new novel, The Zulus of New York. For some of you who have not read it yet, I encourage you to do so. It is an amazing novel. We have a conference on disease which is currently taking place across town in Park Town. And then we have Professor Masilela, who came all the way from Thailand to come and speak here. For some of you who do not know Professor Masilela, I do not know really where to start. He has written extensively on the new African movement. He publishes books that will shame some of us who are much younger than he is. I mean, he literally has a book coming out every year. And we thought the occasion for which we have invited him really deserves to have him coming here. This year is the 100 years of 4 outstanding writers. It is Es'kia Mphahlele, about whom Tongela will speak about this evening. It is Noni Jabavu, and there is somebody who has spent a lot of her time writing about Noni. She's sitting over there. Kosi was writing a biography of Noni Jabavu, and she will speak about him in the next few weeks or so. Then there is Peter Abrams. Peter Abrams, who also have 100 years this year that he lived. And Musiso Nyembezi, who wrote that famous novel, Masilela. So when we thought about this, that it is quite unusual actually that we have 4 outstanding writers who are attending 100 years together. I mean, what our society tends to do is to celebrate politicians, as if you can reduce black life just to politics. What we are doing through these lectures, this is the first of several lectures that we are going to have on these 4 outstanding writers. And so we thought, let's shift a bit. I mean, let's celebrate these people, but also to show to our society that there was more, or there is more to life than just politics alone. Because we get to celebrate these events, if it is Mandela, as it was the case last year, it was 100 years of Mandela. The year before, it was Oliver Tambo, which is not to say these individuals did not make significant contributions. But we thought this time around, let's focus on our culture as a people, that we have these 4 individuals who make these outstanding contributions. But we'll do more than lectures. We have a partnership now with the Market Theatre to do plays on the works of these individuals. So there is a lot more that we'll be doing. But we are greatly honored this evening that we have Professor Masilela, who has come all the way, as I have said, from Thailand to talk about the contributions of Es'kia Mphahlele. Welcome, Professor. Over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation, first and foremost. And it's really difficult for me to talk about Ezekiel Mphahlele. Because the deep subjective element of mine is involved in looking at him, which I'll read the paper. Because from the age of 9 in Soweto, on Maseko Street, not far from Tom's Hall, I was really aware when I was about 9 years old. That means before Mphahlele left, 1857, to go to Nigeria, when he left South Africa, that there was something extraordinary about Ezekiel Mphahlele. The particularity of that was that he always wore a white shirt and a tie. Every time I remember him when I was that young, he always wore a shirt and a tie. And I never, ever forgot that impression of him, of his distinctiveness, of his particularity. And I was friends with one of his elder sons, Tony Mphahlele. So there's a deep subjective element of mine involved in articulating my perspective on Mphahlele, because to me it was something like a god. But I think I'm objective in the paper, partly because I have some critical things to say on Mphahlele, very critical things. But my criticalness is overridden by the very fact that in my assessment, I could be mistaken in this, no other South African intellectual of the 20th century has integrated himself or herself to the most important cultural, political, literary movements in Africa in the 20th century. That's the distinctiveness for me of Ezekiel Mphahlele. Not only in Africa, but also in the Caribbean, the Negro Chief movement, and of course the Black Americans stemming from the sort of Harlem Renaissance. So in short, I think my argues paper, which I will read it, argues that Mphahlele's distinctiveness, for me, in his own perspective, was his ability to integrate himself to all the international movements which happened in the black world in the 20th century. And I'm amazed and fascinated by his ability to do that. But when I reflect on it, I think of all the intellectuals, South African intellectuals I had the opportunity to meet, and I met many of them, practically all of them. Because I left South Africa when I was very young, very young. I was 12 years old. I've never lived in South Africa since 1962. I'm coming now. So I really saw many of them from a distance and very close up in exile. Mphahlele was extraordinary about his ability to integrate himself and other nations to accept him in their own context. And therefore, for me, he's truly a father figure, the father figure, in many ways. But what I'll do, I'll just read the paper, probably take about an hour or so. I'll just read the paper, rather than summarizing it. Ezekiel Mphahlele, or Es'kia Mphahlele, as he preferred to be called from the moment of his returning from exile in 1957, was arguably the new African intellectual of the new African movement who has had the most profound influence on this author since it began manifesting itself at a very young age in the 1950s in Orlando West, Soweto. The great man and my family lived in the same row on Masilela Street, separated by approximately 7 houses between us. The address of my family was 8273. The great man's house was at the corner facing Uncle Tom's Hall, and this is about the 1950s. And I'm about 9 years old, and I remember this. The great man's house was facing at the corner facing Uncle Tom's Hall, which today is adjacent to Hector Peterson Museum. It was strange for me being told by a British scholar in 2011 in Los Angeles that Orlando West was the central part of Soweto. In my imagination, that designation at that young age would have been better suited to Morocco, part of Soweto, since this author was a fanatical follower of the Morocco Swallows team in the 1950s. This author, in 2012, wrote a book called bought a book called Orlando West at the Hector Peterson Museum, which shamefully to this day he has not as yet read. But as we all know, Orlando West was where Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela resided in the 1950s, as well as Zephania Mutuping, the principal co-founder of the Pan-Africanist Congress, together with Robert Sobukwe. Some stalwarts of the New African Movement resided in this enclave of Soweto, such as Bishop Desmond Tutu, James Matthews. The latter's house was next door to my family house. What struck me most at that very young age, as I mentioned, was that Ezekiel Mphahlele always wore a white shirt and a tie, that he was immaculately dressed. He suddenly disappeared from my horizon at the age of 9 when he left South Africa for Nigeria in 1957. When, with my parents and my 3 brothers, arrived in Nairobi in 1965 from Los Angeles, having departed from South Africa in 1962, to my great surprise, the great man was there with his family. Now, at the age of 16, I was afforded an opportunity to look at him up close. Unfortunately, our families intercrossed each other for only a year before Mphahlele and his family departed for the United States, where he was given a professorship in the English department at the University of Denver, Colorado. The 3 years Mphahlele spent in Kenya afforded him an opportunity to immensely influence the then emergent national literary culture by founding literary magazines, as well as gallery spaces for exhibitions and intellectual discourses. This was the judgment given to me, or this author, by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, when both of us were colleagues in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California in Irvine, a suburb of Los Angeles, from 1999 to 2008. The aforementioned here in Nairobi afforded this author an opportunity to look at the great man up close. This admiration, stemming from a relatively close examination, resulted nearly 40 years later on in my 50-page chapter, Ezekiel Mphahlele, the last intellectual of the New African Movement, which is in this author's book, The Historical Figures of the New African Movement, published in 2014. Ezekiel Mphahlele's intellectual and cultural engagement with the contemporary black world was not only confined to Africa, specifically Nigeria and Kenya, but also to the New World, particularly the United States. In this particular instance, it was the influence of the New Negroes, of the New Negro movement in the United States, on the New Africans of the New African movement in South Africa. The influence of Richard Wright on Ezekiel Mphahlele was inescapable. In other words, profound. Implicitly taking the New Negro and the New African as an exemplification of this interconnection, a few parallels and contrasts can be indicated here between the United States and South Africa. First, the United States has had a profound impact on South Africa throughout the 20th century. This influence hinged on the question of how could black people empower themselves into modernity under the dire conditions of Jim Crow in the United States and racial discrimination and colonial oppression in South Africa. How could black people align themselves with this European invention, yet at the same time transform it in accordance with their particular historical imperatives. Second, African Americans in the United States and Africans in South Africa were arguably among the oppressed black people in the world in the early years of the 20th century. Perhaps, much more importantly, they were oppressed by societies which were in the forefront of forging modernity politically and economically. The United States accelerating its construction of modernity and for the first time entering the imperial domain of domination. And Britain, the then dominant imperial hegemon, was at the height of its imperial domination. France, throughout the 19th century and in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, had a profound self-consciousness about the nature of modernity. Third, as blacks were being transformed and equally transforming themselves in the maelstrom of the making of American modernity, those in the middle and the forefront of the experience designated themselves as the new Negroes, in distinction from the old Negroes who were still laboring under the slavery conditions despite the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Likewise, in South Africa, struggling in the midst of a different historical divide, Africans who align themselves with European modernity with the intent, align themselves with European modernity with the intent of transforming it, called themselves the New Africans in order to distinguish themselves from those they designated as old Africans in traditional societies. Fourth, it was the Christian missionaries who shepherded New Africans into European modernity through the Holy Trinity of Christianity, European civilization, and European education. We would like to emphasize here, since we will not say much about it any further, it was the missionaries who enabled and shepherded emergent New Africans in the direction of modernity. And I want to emphasize this because within the last 50 years, many books have been written in Africa and in South Africa denigrating the role of the missionaries, which I totally disagree with because I know what they are. This was the position of the New African intellectual Masilela, whose greatness is still not fully recognized. And let me stop here to criticize myself here about Masilela. I personally think that Masilela is arguably the greatest intellectual in South Africa, period. White, red, blue, or white, in what he did in South Africa. Okay. In my book, in my first book, I forgot what it's called. The sketches of him. I had harsh words to say about Masilela. But at the same time, I recognize his greatness. But I had harsh words to say about him because of his political perspectives, what he became. And I'm in the process now of writing a 300-page monograph on Masilela to modify the harshness I said about Masilela. But I never for once deluded myself from recognizing that in my estimation he was probably the greatest New African intellectual. It was in the struggle with European missionaries about transforming European modernity into quote-unquote new African modernity, or inventing a new variant of it in parallel with it, that the new Africans drew inspiration from the new Negro modernity, then being forged by the new Negroes, of course, in the United States. In much as the new Negroes constituted constellations of the new Negro movement in the process of making or constructing new Negro modernity, new Africans in our country did likewise in constructing new African modernity through their own constellations of the new African movement. And in my website, which I worked on it for 15 years, on the new African movement, I really did draw the constellations, about 10 or 15 of them, and the particular figures in it. And let me see this in passing, which is not here. I would not have done my new African website without two South African whites who were Jewish, Professor Leo Cooper and Professor Hilda Cooper, who left South Africa, went to UCLA, bought Ben Makubane, Anthony Ngubo, they both passed away, who also bred A.C. Jordan, who else? And a few other people, okay? And when they were there, the Coopers constructed the library on Africa and South Africa. When I was a student in the 1970s at UCLA, I could see all of what they had done. And this is with the intent of saying here, this not written here, is it is imperative, I believe, and it's my belief, that we begin to reconstruct our cultural, intellectual history in which white people, coloreds, Indians are not on the margins. Especially the whites. Especially the whites. Despite apartheid. This is very, very fundamental. Because if we do not do that, we're not doing an honest, scholarly, objective work. Because without some of these people like Hilda Cooper and so on, we will not have the intellectual tradition which we have today. But to move on, fifth, when Ezekiel Es'kia Mphahlele, a Zulu young man of 23 years old, then a senior at Columbia University, penned his manifesto in 1904, The Regeneration of Africa, which proclaimed the then unfolding 20th century as a century of modernity in Africa. He was in Harlem, inside the epicenter of the making of the new Negro movement. The title of this essay was not original, since the great new Negro intellectual, Alexander Crummell, had used it for his essay that was published in 1863. Astonishingly, and when Samuel wrote this essay, he was a young man, he was 22, 23 years old. Okay. Astonishingly, this essay by Ezekiel Es'kia Mphahlele was compiled in a book of essays published in 1910 in the United States called The Black Man, consisting of contributions from the stellar list of new Negro intellectuals such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Alexander Crummell, and others. I emphasize this to say that the new Negroes saw in Seme, before his great failures, which all of us, and Professor Masilela has really taught us, that Seme was a man of destiny. And I think Seme was a man of destiny until his moral turpitude made him what he became. And we should not, in my estimation, not recognize the greatness of Samuel in this particular moment. This same Samuel, this same Ezekiel Es'kia Samuel, 8 years later, in 1912, assembled for the first time the African National Congress. The manifesto of Ezekiel Es'kia Samuel was one of the major texts that launched the New African movement. 6, the influence of the New Negro movement on the New African movement began with Alexander Crummell's impact on the Xhosa intellectuals of the 1880s and 1870s, and ended with Richard Wright's influence in the 1940s on the young New African writers who would be known as the drum writers of the 1950s, or more properly, as the Supertown Renaissance. The drum writers were the last constellation of the New African movement, which was terminated through political repression immediately following the Chauvin massacre in 1960. The influence of New Negro modernity on New African modernity was in the intellectual and artistic spheres of politics, religion, literature, philosophy, film, and music. Here, I'm interconnecting New Negro modernity and New African. 7, Alexander Crummell, who was a free Negro and reverend of the church, spent several decades proselytizing Sierra Leone from the middle of the 19th century and never personally experienced enslavement, unequivocally argued that Africans must engage and enter modernity because traditional societies were quote-unquote backward entities characterized by heathenism. To him, this explained the necessity of Christianity in Africa. He considered African languages barbaric, quotation marks, and unsuitable for modernity. He praised the English language and English literary culture as the authentic cultural facilitators of Africans' entrance into modernity. This is a very important thing, which I think we as scholars need to examine. Although some of the Xhosa intellectuals of the 1880s, consisting of Elijah Matuane, William Wellington Grover, White Mzashe, James Duane, Pambani Jeremiah Mzimba, Isaac W. Wachope, John Tego Jabavu, Walter Biru Wasana, John Knox Bope, William Coy, Shadrach Gunana, Mapasa, Didi, Maniwe Wachope, Tause Soga, Daniel Duanya, Robert R. Manzai, Thomas Nkanda, Atwell Massey, F. Jonas, and William D. Soga disagreed with this tone of Crummell, but the majority seemed to have agreed with the historical backing. It was Crummell, in effect, who brought William Shakespeare to Africa, not the European missionaries, as one would have expected and is supposed by many. Let me add that Crummell, surprisingly, despised European missionaries whom he believed incapable of giving proper interpretation of Christianity to Africans because of their racism and the white supremacy they subscribed to. He seemed to have believed in the philosophy of Africa for the Africans. That is, only Africans or only black people can enable black people to enter modernity. I do not agree with the thesis, but I fully understood. I fully understand where it was coming from in the late 19th century. Nkrumah was a proto-Pan-Africanist. Eighth, the utilization of European languages and European literary heritage as intellectual bridgeheads from tradition to modernity not only transformed African literary culture from orality into written form, it also created a bifurcation in African literary history, which has proven intractable throughout the 20th and the 21st century to the present. This is the existence of African literature in the African languages and African literature in the European languages. Ninth, Booker T. Washington had more influence in the political sphere than any other new Negro intellectual or the new African intellectuals. All the founders of the National Congress in 1912 were beholden to him. Be it Arvis Robetema, Solomon T. Placky, John Langalipalele Dube, Walter Benson Rubasana, or Henry Silver Smith. This influence of Washington is a reminder that the New African movement was divided into three components: conservative modernizers, progressive modernizers, and revolutionary modernizers. The impact of Washington was largely confined to the conservative modernizers, but albeit the most powerful politically. Washington imparted to the New Africans the idea of self-empowerment, thus making black people less reliant on white institutions and white people. Observing what the new Negroes had done and achieved, New Africans created their own institutions in the form of newspapers, political parties, and organizations and cultural associations. This is the reason at this time that New African newspapers proliferated. These were the intellectual forums in which the New African intellectuals published their literary works and articulated their understanding of the nature of modernity. This brilliant culture of the New African movement manifested itself in many of these newspapers. The achievement of New African modernity in South Africa demands that evaluation of Booker T. Washington be always done in an international context. 10th, while New Negro modernity was undertaken through the principle of blackness, New African modernity was realized through the idea of Africanness. The idea of Africanness began developing in the late 19th century. It was inclusive of all non-whites, including Indians and colors. In exactly 1900, the ideology of Pan-Africanism was developed in the African diaspora and was brought to South Africa in the same year by the Ghanaian intellectual F.Z.S. Peregrine. He spent the last 20 years of his life in South Africa publishing his newspaper, South Africa Spectator, through which he propagated this ideology. It was in the context of this imported contending ideologies in the 1930s, among them Marxism that the philosophy and idea of African nationalism emerged. The important figure in this theorization of African nationalism was again Es'kia Mphahlele, a very complex person. One of the spectacular events of the 1930s was the outbreak of an ideological warfare between African nationalism and Marxism within the African National Congress and also within the New African Movement. It was in this context of this ideological contestation that modern African literature, which aligned itself with African nationalism, came into being. One component, African literature, in the European languages signified by the publication of Solomon Tipaki's Mhudi in 1930, the short stories of Arzomo, and short stories and poetry of Peter Abrams. The other component, African literature in the African languages, signified a decade earlier by the publication of Shaka in 1925 in Sesotho by Thomas Mofolo, and in isiXhosa, the poetry in Kali and Autism, Mgwetho. And let me stop and say, not written here, I think Autism Mgwetho is the greatest thing that has happened in South Africa in the 20th century, in the literary sphere. I repeat, Autism Mgwetho is the greatest thing that has ever happened in South Africa in the 20th century. Myself, I'm struggling to write a book on it. 11th and lastly, as already mentioned, the new Negro movement was terminated by the state repression following the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. The African National Congress and the Pan-African Congress and Southern Communist Party were banned. Many new African intellectuals and political leaders were arrested and charged with treason, and some fled into exile. Nelson Mandela went underground, but was subsequently arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment. Mandela served 27 years before he was released in February 1990. But before the precipitous end happened in 1960, the 1950s have been characterized as a fabulous decade for one of the major figures of Msigosi, of the drum writers, or the Sowetan Renaissance that happened in this decade. Similar to the new Negro movement, which had created the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. So the new Negro movement likewise realized the Sowetan Renaissance in the 1950s. While the Harlem Renaissance was in all probability the highest cultural expression of new Negro modernity, that does not seem to have been the case with the Sowetan Renaissance regarding new African modernity. This was a major difference that needs to be investigated in detail in another context. Now I enter into Ezekiel Mphahlele specifically. But what I've said was everything behind Ezekiel Mphahlele, which determined what Ezekiel Mphahlele was. And I had many occasions to talk with Ezekiel Mphahlele in Nairobi, in Denver, in Los Angeles. So now I gravitate to Ezekiel Mphahlele. But I don't think you can understand Ezekiel Mphahlele without the whole of this drama which was happening in the Black World. Because of all the people, South Africans, Ezekiel Mphahlele, because he inherited this drama of the formation of modernity in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, he was able to penetrate Africa more than any other African intellectual, not only South Africa. He integrated himself in many of the cultures in Africa at this particular time. And to me, that's the most profound distinctiveness, greatness of Ezekiel Mphahlele. Not so much his writing, even though his writing is very important and excellent, but he was able to forge the emergence of modernity in Kenya and in many other African countries. I had a long talk with Wafiong when we spent a decade together there. He even said himself, he thinks that Prof. Mphahlele is the most important intellectual rather than a writer of the 20th century in his estimation. Now I go to Mphahlele, but with having sketched the historical drama which leads to him. With books such as The African Image, 1959, The Wanderers, 1971, Voices in the Whirlwind, and other essays, 1971, and others indicate the nature of Mphahlele's deep rootedness in Africa, in the African diaspora, and lastly, in international cosmopolitanism. His seemingly precipitous decision to return home a year following the Soweto uprising in 1976 was met with great consternation in many circles of South Africans' exile community, while at home it was generally cautiously embraced as perhaps indicating the acceptation of the beginning of a new historical era. Arguably, and I want to talk about this because in exile, Mphahlele is returning to South Africa. Literally creating trauma within the ANC and with all the intellectuals, South Africans. How could Mphahlele return to South Africa after 1976? And what would be the consequences of it? At this time myself, I was a student at the University of California in Los Angeles. Arguably, the decision of Ezekiel Mphahlele during the interregnum period, or exile period, 1960 to 1994, to return home in 1977, had to be one of the most courageous acts that unleashed the greatest consternation in our country's political and cultural history in the 20th century. This remarkable and courageous political decision made it extremely difficult for many years to write dispassionately about the creative and critical works of Ezekiel Mphahlele or Es'kia Mphahlele. Each name designated a different historical moment. Each defined a particular ensemble of complex political and literary relationships. It was this return of the prodigal son that completely polarized and caused pandemonium among South African writers, artists, intellectuals at home, and those in exile. The exile contingent condemned Mphahlele unremittingly and in uncertain terms. In this group were, among others, Louis Nkosi, Daniel Pikunene, Dennis Brutus, and Bernard Makubane. Those back at home, which included Dan Matera and Nadine Godoma, had been generally sympathetic towards Mphahlele. What this short listing clearly indicated was that the pro-Mphahlele and the contra-Mphahlele positions confounded complacent political positions and received intellectual wisdom. For instance, aligned against each other were two Marxists or socialists. Makubane against Mphahlele and Godema for Mphahlele. Equally, aligned against each other were two humanists. The humanism of the poet and creative writer, Dan Matera, had positioned itself against the humanism of the literary scholar and critic, and until recently creative writer, Daniel Pikunen. Further contradictory contrasts could be drawn, but these are sufficient to signal the trauma the return of Mphahlele caused in South African intellectual circles, at home and abroad. What was absent in the above mapping of political intellectual positions concerning the phenomenon of Mphahlele was the position of the younger generations of South Africans, the generations represented at a later moment of staff writers. Though myself not belonging to the impressive, extremely talented constellation of writers and poets, so far as never having had the privilege of appearing in his pages, this author belonged to this generation. What was incontrovertibly clear and a historical gain was that the return of Mphahlele to South Africa opened and founded a landscape of the cultural politics of intervention in the long revolution, then slowly but surely gathering tempo and velocity in South Africa. It was the opening of the curtain camouflaging the landscape by Mphahlele, to be sure unintentionally and accidentally, that made his return to South Africa a decisive historical moment. That Mphahlele himself did not understand the political consequences of his action should not hinder us from drawing the necessary historical lessons. Mphahlele was hindered in understanding the political consequences of his action by the ideology of abstract humanism, to which he wholeheartedly subscribed. If a later literary piece from Mphahlele, the autobiography, a continuation of Down Second Avenue, Africa My Music, was an apology for his return back home. It only confirmed the political Philistinism of abstract humanism. Only a materialist dialectic could draw the necessary historical lessons. When Lucy Nkosi, in a later article, South African fiction writers at the barricades fulminated against Mphahlele, also against Miriam Bali, Sepemla, Tutuzele Machova, Loretta Ngobo, Njabulele Lepele, Mbulelo Mzamani, and Richard Reeve. You only confirm that in another context I've described as the anarchistic agnosticism. In a later unpublished essay, we examined the triadic structure of Mphahlele's abstract humanism, Nkosi's anarchistic agnosticism, and Nadine Gordimer's revolutionary socialism within the context of the drum generation. Lucy Nkosi, by the way, since I'm castigating Lucy Nkosi, I respected and I loved Nkosi with all my heart. And I had really fights with him. I had fights with him in Europe and in America. So my criticism of Nkosi is not by any means a denigration. It's an attempt to indicate that to us in exile, apartheid was a trauma we carried with us. It's not something we left behind in South Africa because we're in exile. We really carried with us. Not myself really, I was too young. I never experienced it, but I could see in the faces of all the great writers that apartheid they took with them into exile. Okay, so then I'll sort of go further on. Besides opening the possibilities of the new cultural politics of intervention in the then developing situation in South Africa, the return of Mphahlele back home made it possible for a whole generation of young South African writers, intellectuals, and artists to retrace and re-establish the literary and cultural connections and continuities between the staff writers and the drum writers. This was a tremendous gain on the part of the younger generations in South Africa, even if the old guard outside South Africa have not been able to see it as such. The wisdom of the old guard was concentrated on the matters of more pertaining to the acquiring of political power and state power on behalf of the wretched of the earth in South Africa, not immediately focused on cultural matters. And what I'm trying to say here is I totally disagree with the position of the ANC, because I do not think the ANC as a political organization to which I belonged and I still belong understood the complexity, the cultural complexity of the intervention of Mphahlele by returning to South Africa. And I did say so to some of the people, that Mphahlele return to South Africa was opening a new chapter. What was shocking about it was its unexpectancy, so violent, so determined by Mphahlele, when Mphahlele is one of the kindest, softest people I've ever met myself, really. And for me, in a way, Mphahlele was a Democrat, had opened up a revolutionary act in South African history, returning to South Africa. And I fully supported that. The essays of Mphahlele in Staff Writer magazine assisted younger generations of South Africans in reconstructing a cultural and literary history of our people. The point of disagreement and contention with Mphahlele had been on the political nature of that reconstruction, whereas some of us insisted on a historical materialist perspective, Mphahlele had been content to rehash a liberal perspective, however cynically told. The superior quality of Mphahlele's intervention in comparison with Louis Nkosi's anarchism was beyond discussion and dispute. What was unsettling and unacceptable in some of Mphahlele's literary work were the strands of national chauvinism against other African countries, which now and then plagued his literary practice. To be sure, these strokes of nihilism were the byproduct of his bitter proud experience in those countries. What I'm trying to say here is that Mphahlele was not a saint. To me, he was a saint, but he was not a saint politically, culturally, ideologically. In contrast to the negativism of Louis Nkosi, Nadine Godoma never ceased celebrating the return to Mphahlele. Though in public celebrating it in historical terms, this cannot hide the fact that there were deeply hidden personal passions that unrelentingly fueled. Oh, I see that some people have the papers already. Eh? Okay. Where's Bongani? Where's Bongani? Did I not send it to you? And you condemned me an hour ago that I did not. Okay, I'm happy. Okay, I'm very happy. Thank you so much. Because I'm getting old, you know. I'm sure I sent this thing to Bongani 3 days before I left. But Bongani tells me it's not. Oh my God. I'm getting old. I am getting old, but not that old. Because I made sure he had this thing. He demanded from me. It's a demand, the request. And I sent it to him. And I he said, no, I've not received it. You didn't send it. I said, what do you mean I didn't send it? Okay. I'll continue. Reading. Okay. And let me stop and say this thing. I worship Lady Guadalupe. I seriously worship Lady Guadalupe. She's to me, and I'm prepared to fight with anybody. Because it's only when we fight seriously among ourselves that we take our culture seriously. Okay? It's not a wrong thing, in my estimation, unless I'm an old foggy daddy from a long time ago. But I really do worship. I'm not the person that cannot do anything. But maybe we'll debate together before I take up with other people. Okay, let me continue here. In Nadine Gordimer's writings, both creative and critical, the public sphere and the private sphere are historically interconnected to each other. But what gave historical legitimacy to Nadine Gordimer's endorsement of Mphahlele's return was a profound understanding of the cultural politics of intervention historically demanded of both white and black South Africans. Though the historical callings were different from each other, they found their unity in this political and cultural practice. In brief, but profoundly penetrative essay, Nadine Gordimer argued that only the black South African writer had been able to forge a reconciliation between the demands made on the writer by society and the writer's commitment to his or her artistic vision. In the context of South Africa, it was the conflict between the demands of society and how they should be met that has made any activity of creativity treacherously difficult and challenging. It was a failure in this understanding of this complex issue that made some elements of Louis Ngosi's literary criticism a catastrophe and unmitigated disaster. It was. Let me see this. What I'm saying about Louis Ngosi, I spent about 3 days with him in Warsaw, violently arguing about this matter. And Louis Ngosi knew my position, but I always accepted Louis Ngosi as my elder brother. Before I left Europe, in fact, I was living in Germany. I decided I have to go pay my respects to Louis Ngosi, who was living in Warsaw, before I left Europe to go to the United States, where I remained first in my life. So I have great respect for all the people I criticize here. Please, that should not be taken as a denigration. Because I still find with Louis Ngosi about these things, and I really love them. But the main things are criticizing Louis Ngosi, which I cannot accept. Okay, I still want to go on a little bit. Okay, I want to go on to the struggle between Lusingosi and Ezekiel Mphahlele, which I think is much more important. I'm sorry for skipping here a little bit about Nadine Goroma. But as I mentioned, Nadine Goroma is very important to me. At one time I had an argument with Lusingosi about Nadine Goroma. It's true. And I stood up after being very violently angry to Lusingosi. I said, Nadine Goroma is sacred. It's sacred to me, Louis. You knew her as a person, I don't, but her writings are sacred. So don't talk to me about Nadine Goroma, the way you talk. And I think I was about to cry or what. Louis just stopped. He just stopped. He said, yeah, younger brother, I'm stopping. Not because I agree with you, because you will learn a few things in life. Then you moved on to other things. And I really loved all of these people I'm talking about here. And I equally criticize, because they meant so much to me. I will not be who I am today without them. I was very, very, very privileged to have gone into exile. And something on the note, here's what all of us here in the discussion, something completely away from here. Here's I'm talking about Nadine Goroma. Something I'm deeply worried about. I think we are in a process of betraying the legacy of Nelson Mandela, from my perspective. Given Nadine Goroma, I'm really deeply worried that our writings, 25 years after the change in our country, we have not made our perspectives integrative of all the people of South Africa in the reconstruction of the new and cultural history of South Africa. I'll come out openly. I'm violently opposed to ideas like black archives, black perspectives. I don't know black perspective. I don't know what's black archives. My archives. I just spent 15 years in the cellars. I knew African archives. Indians are there, colors are there, Africans are there. In my limited way, the Khoisan are there, and the other people, of course, I just forgotten it is. And I think it's really imperative. That's my personal opinion, and I'm struggling to do that we should write new literal histories of South Africa, cultural history, which are truly integrative of the complexity of who we are as South Africans. What makes us distinct and particular with South Africans is that we're Indians, we're blacks, we're Jews, we're blah 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 blah, which makes our nation in the forefront in Africa. Some Africans don't want to like hearing that. It's not because we are special. It's because what happened in our history, the tragic drama which happened in our history, which did not happen in any other place. And the only reason for that, we have to be honest, is gold, diamonds, blah 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 blah, which we have in South Africa. But I think we really need to start writing a truly integrative literal history, cultural history of our country. Otherwise, we'll make our children pay a heavy price. I think, what's it, Woman? Oh, I see. My brother, my dear brother, I think we should have something on an integrated cultural history or understanding of New South Africa from the perspective of Nelson Mandela. I'm saying to you because the only person I know. Really, we need to do that. We need to do that. We need to write integrated histories. But I have about 67 more pages to go. Okay. Perhaps the deep animus between Mphahlele and Nkosi, I'm on page 9 for those who have the paper. Perhaps the deep animus between Mphahlele and Nkosi can partly be explained by the fact that they were among the last colossal surviving figures of the drum generation. The real and undefined object of dispute between them was the question of the proper interpretation and reconstruction of this particular literary moment, in which both of them found their literary voices. Neither of them has provided the proper historical instruments through which to grasp the literary moment of their youth. If the writings of Ken Temba have been the literary signature of the drum generation, then indisputably the reportages of Henry Mumalo possess the sociological perspective with which to reconstruct this literary moment. In other words, and in effect, the dispute between them was historically unfounded for the shaping of the cultural and literary history in which both of them played a fundamental role, was politically determined at the very moment of their literary emergence. And I sort of skip a little bit, since you have the paper, it's been taken for a long time. If I may be allowed see. Okay, for those, I'm sort of torn, for those people who don't have the paper, because I really want to go towards the end. It's really, since the papers are available, I'll not read the whole papers, you know. The papers are available now. I started reading it because Bongani told me, no, you didn't send me the thing. I said, Bongani, I'm really old, but not that old, because you berated me in Thailand that you want the papers within 15 hours, my brother. I did that. Okay, so the papers, we have the papers. Everyone has a paper, so I want to continue. And we can continue to debate later in the sense, if you read something you disagree with, we can have a communication among ourselves, or send a communication to me, or we can have a forum in which we can all discuss about these things, really. Because this is only one perspective, my particular perspective. I think it's better now for me to shut up, since because then we sort of have a discussion and disagreement and how we move forward. Let me say, all the people I criticize in this paper, I hold dearly in my heart as my teachers. The criticism was mainly for political differences. It was not personal animosity, but imagination. I profoundly respect all of them. So I'll stop here, since everyone has a paper now. Yeah, I'll stop here. If I may.
Let's give so colleagues, we'll open it up for questions and comments. We should take 5 for a start, then we'll take the next one. Those who have questions or comments. Yes,
Sure.
Thank you, Professor, so much for this wonderful, wide-ranging and yet detailed account. I was thinking before you mentioned Ngugi that I think it's in his memoir on his Makerere years that he talks about how thrilling it was for him to be critiqued by Mphahlele at a Pan-African literary conference. And he was the young James Ngugi, still an undergraduate, and a story of his had been chosen to be critiqued. And he says, Mphahlele torqued up one side and down the other. And that he was exhilarated by this, that someone would take his work, you know, a major published author would take his work so serious. And I'm just thinking of your final comments about what you are saying is not personal. You know, you have your disagreements with people whom you respect very much. Where do you see this space now? For people with different views about African literature, African culture, African activism, to give this kind of exhilarating critique, the experience that we had with Mphahlele, that helped him to become a greater writer, but seemed in no way to humiliate him or make him feel rejected for positions he was taking or things he was trying to do in his life.
Yeah.
Any other question?
Yeah. Oh,
Just take maybe just
already?
2 more and then you speak.
Bongani,
Yes.
I'm an old man.
Oh,
I have 2 or 3 questions I forget.
okay, so answer then I'll take the 2 colleagues and you.
Yeah, okay. Then, I don't know where I know the answer. And my easy answer would be the question of the uniqueness of Nelson Mandela in African history, in African history. In my humble opinion, I think future generations will write about us with a personal experience engagement with Mandela that we do not fully understand. The greatness of Mandela, because we have not produced works which emanate from that legacy and are comparable with that legacy. I struggled with in one of my essays. I contributed to one of the books on Nelson Mandela. I really the international acceptance of Mandela, which was a great acclamation. I think, let me talk about myself now. I don't want to talk about South Africa. Was so great, was so overwhelming that talking about myself, it paralyzed me to fully understand the greatness of Mandela. Really, I'm totally convinced that future generations would say, you thought you knew Mandela, but you did not fully understand Mandela. I say myself, I'm a Marxist. I have to come up openly on the table. I say that as a Marxist, that there's something deep inside Mandela, which was inside him, which for me, I don't fully understand. And I tried to struggle with it in one of the essays I wrote for one of the anthologies of Mandela. I looked at it as Marxist writings of the 1950s in some of the journals. I think for me, the issue is Mandela. Do we fully understand Mandela? Do we fully understand the legacy of Mandela? And what do we mean we fully understand the legacy of Mandela? Rather than imbibing what has universally been accepted. What can we exemplify that this is a legacy? These are the ethics of Mandela. These are understandings of Mandela. That's what personal then I'm totally opposed to anything about blackness of this, blackness of that. Because it is a fundamental betrayal of the legacy of Nelson Mandela. And I'm prepared to fight anyone. I'm prepared to fight anyone. I'm prepared to fight anyone. I've written my books. And I've about 5 books which are going to be published. So I'm not talking up about that. And I'd love to write a monograph about Mandela, but Mandela is up there for me. I can't go out there. And I mean, if nothing else, I mean, I should talk about my motherland. Because I've lived here for 42 years. And I'm not truly a South African. I'm a Kenyan. I'm not a South African, I have to be honest. I left South Africa when I was 12 years old. And I was 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, I was in Kenya. Everything I became was in Kenya, not in South Africa, not in South Africa. So I'm not really, my mother is Xhosa, but denying it, and my father is a Ndebele. But culturally, I'm not a South African. I have to be very, very honest. You know, everything I became was in Kenya. Really, everything I became was in Kenya. I'm sorry for saying that. But I love my motherland. I love my motherland. But I'm not really South African. I've stopped it.
Looks like, Professor, you're going to fight for a lot of people.
Oh! That's what forums are for, right? That's what forums are for.
Okay, the next one is, we see then I'll come to you, Professor Masilela.
Interestingly, earlier, before you came, we were talking about the session. Earlier on, before you came, we were talking about the relative silence of black intellectuals in apartheid, relative absence perhaps. And somewhere here, and we were saying perhaps it could have been because of the harsh conditions of the time, and that people made it was easier for them to make it overseas than here at home. But you also mentioned here that when Mphahlele came back home in the 70s, he was relatively silent on political questions. He didn't engage much. If he did, perhaps he used a somewhat moderate voice. I wanted to explain that a little bit. Then there's a second point that you made earlier in your talk. You are quite absolute about your disapproval of what you say is denigration of the role of missionaries.
Of whose
Denigration of the role of missionaries by many books that have been written, you said. And you say you are totally opposed to this of the denigration of missionaries.
Which is not the same thing as a critique. Denigration is different to me from a critique. And I don't want these things to collapse and intentionally to each other.
Yeah, perhaps I should finish the point.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the views that have been expressed, well, you can, in your answer, perhaps explain clearly whether it's a critique or that's my understanding of the was possible.
Yeah.
But my reading of that history is that
the missionary history.
Missionary history, yes. That critique and possibly the denigration was not entirely unwarranted. Perhaps it pointed to the complexity of the missionary role. That their role was not unilinear. It was multi-layered.
Yeah.
That they were complicit in conquest.
Yeah.
So I'm then trying to understand your absolute disapproval of the denigration.
Of the missionary history.
Yes. Because in my view, they are not.
But I'm an atheist. I'm an atheist.
They were.
So don't accuse me. I'm an atheist, my brother.
Right? Yes, they introduced literary culture into it, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, they were complicit in conquest in order to advance.
Yeah.
the literary project, because there was resistance to missionary influence, and they thought the only way they could advance that was break down African society.
Not the missionaries. Not the missionaries. But finish your idea.
I'm finished, just as absolutely mysterious as you are.
It is a very difficult question, and it's a historical dilemma. And I'm sort of afraid to go to that territory. It is hard for me, and of course I went to a missionary school at Tulasizwe in Natal, just before I left, which was a Catholic. My response to you would be, what the missionaries brought, or what they facilitated, was a question of modernity. It was a question of modernity. It was imperative for everyone, whether you accept it or not, that to go forward in history, you have to engage with modernity. So the missionaries were part of that project. I do not know of any historical enterprise in human history which consisted only or predominantly of positive aspects without the negative aspects, given that us, who are human beings, were infallible. This is not the excuse of the role of the missionaries. To criticize the missionaries, or even, the Europeans as a whole, is to not to consider them as human beings, is to want to see them as infallible in one form or another. There is no way that as human beings there would not be disastrous consequences from that. But would we be sitting here? I mean, let's be really honest. Would we be sitting here without the missionaries, without the entrance of modernity in African history? Would we be sitting with this? Let's be real. The printing press in Europe, which came to South Africa. Would we already know how to use this? No, I mean, real. So, yes, there were tragedies. There were massacres. There were killings, because we human beings are infallible. I'm not excusing them. Now, I'm not saying there were not situations in which some whites, because of white supremacist ideas, went to kill black people or kill something like that. But to me, it's part of the imperfectibility of human beings. Really. Among us blacks, did we not commit similar things to what Europeans did to us? Could we claim, honestly? Shaka is great for the Zulu, the Sutu, but, Sutu would say, but, they're trying to say, but, right? Am I right or wrong?
Correct.
Yeah. So,
and
so,
we can talk about them as well, but now we're talking of missionaries, right?
No. The thesis is this. My thesis was this: as human beings, we're infallible. Infallible.
Not infallible.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Mphahlele. I wanted to say that. I'm sorry. You know, it's us as human beings. We are not. We are not. If others will need it. No, so for me, I'm critical of certain things. But there's a line I draw when you're being critical of something, you start criticizing the other one because of distinctiveness from you, that either he is black, green, or blue, or belongs to this gender or this something like that. Then that's really disastrous territories. So we start doing that, we start killing people. That's my brother, I agree with you, but these are the contradictions of being human, because we're not perfect. So I accept it. You know, I accept it, I do not accept it, but I accept it, I do not accept it, and move forward.
Next message.
The other question, Brian.
There are many people who have raised hands.
But I asked 2 questions. You only answered 1 question.
The colonialism was similar volatility.
No, Mphahlele was silent, so we came back, we didn't engage in political questions. That's the question.
Mphahlele was never engaged himself with political questions anywhere he was. Mphahlele never. See, if Mphahlele engaged himself with political questions in exile and comes home and doesn't engage himself, then that critique is legitimate.
Why was that? That's what, I'm curious to find out why he didn't engage.
Yeah, you know, Mphahlele was to me like a father, because our families, I mentioned passing the paper. Then I was 15 years old, as I mentioned. Before I was 9 years old, when I saw Mphahlele, I knew it was just something peculiar, something distinct, but I didn't know that. I really got the chance to see Mphahlele when I was. Mphahlele was profoundly a humanist. I don't know what that means, to be honest. I'm honest. Mphahlele was profoundly a humanist, in a true sense. He supported, in my observation of him, without him having said so, I'm not aware of his writings. To me, he tended to lean towards the Pan-Africanist Congress, not towards the ANC. Okay. For me, when I used to, for about a year, my family and his family used to go there, either come to my family or something like that. I think was profoundly the most profound humanist I know of in South Africa, in a true sense. You know, but I think he would disagree with us. In my estimation, he would say that he was much closer to the Pan-Africanist Congress. And I saw many things in Mphahlele which made me feel that spiritually he was much closer to the Pan-Africanist Congress than to the ANC position. But your question still stands, why he never articulated that? I think I have no answer. Perhaps the humanism obviated him from doing that. But I have no question in my mind that was really deep down in his heart. Having spent that year, and later on I met with him, he was really a Pan-Africanist Congress of Robert Sobukwe.
No, I was thinking that if he was a Pan-Africanist, how come he was a serious criticizer of negritude? Mphahlele was, in fact, the Anglophone writers were mostly against Francophone negritude of Amos who were particularly articulating the issues of Africa. So, I mean, if he was a Pan-Africanist, he should have, in my view, he should have agreed with Césaire, you know, with Amos Césaire and yes, sorry.
Let me answer a question. In my understanding
It's not a question, I'm just saying.
No. Mphahlele was never, ever against the leadership movement. He never. Mphahlele was never, ever against. I'm not defending Mphahlele. I know the point. When you were big brother,
Yes,
big brother.
Yes.
Yeah. Mphahlele, with respect to you.
Oh, yes, sir.
We say this is wedding cup in Italian. We're big brother to you.
Yes, sir.
Mphahlele, at the most, he disagreed with the nuances within which the leadership movement was moving. As I said to you, Mphahlele never, as far as I know, never came out politically vis-a-vis the ANC and the peace. And I've never seen any of his writings on that. But having seen him so many times, especially in Kenya, just the way he was, the way he spoke, I knew that he was Pan-Africanist in his deep heart. Now, I will not necessarily run away to extrapolate from it that he was against the ANC. But in his deep heart was a preference for his Congress. Therefore, extending that to the leadership movement was not really, not necessarily hostile. You know, for me, hostile, you have to make a serious, valid critique of something, then you're hostile to it. I think for me, Mphahlele, I don't know the psychology of Mphahlele, but Mphahlele never, ever, ever had violent. He was not a violent person.
No,
I'm just saying that, you know, I'm just saying that he was never. That's why I love the man so much. So he's, if he was against something, it was in the sense of sort of disagreement rather than a rejection or something like that. It was just his nature, you know, just in his nature, which you just, Mphahlele was a saint. I'm serious. So he was never. He never came out violently on anything that I know of. He can be angry, but what I observed in him, I always believe, if the chips are down, Mphahlele will be on the side of the Pan-Africanist Congress against ANC, but not necessarily in the sense of rejection, but in the sense of preference. You know, you prefer this over that, but it doesn't mean necessarily that you reject it. That's why I love the man, because I'm a man of extremes. I love Mphahlele with all my heart, and he knew that. And of course, I also was interested in his daughter, you know, Teresa. Mphahlele would say, "You think I'm a dumb man, you know?" Yeah. I said, "No, I'm not dumb." So, but that's another story.
Just like to Professor Masilela,
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting discussion. And I love the energy in it because it clarifies certain questions that have been in my head all these years. And especially, Prof, the question that you raised about the PC and IMS is you know, at the heart of this, remember the controversy that was attending, I said, at the ALA conference, African Social Security 2004, when he was actually, the people that had been with him at Black Office in Nigeria, turned against him and called him a CIA agent because he had unwittingly founded a very good movement in Bali, for example, but the funds were sourced from an agent that was representing the CIA. But for me, that is not very key. I think, you know, at a certain moment you shift your allegiances depending on the circumstances. You know, he had enough opportunity to consort with people like Masilela and others in exile. And he's a Pan-Africanist, and he doesn't fall short of making mention here and there, even making some kind of references in his book, The Wanderers. I think there's a question of irresolution of him being an activist or not being an activist. He therefore displays his role through his son in that book, The Wanderers. But I think the key thing here, which I believe and I think is very important, is your very clear and lucid delineation of the key defining moments on the evolution of what counts as cultural history today. I think that is something that I actually need to applaud in no small measure. My concern is that there are two things that stood out, and I just wanted to get some maybe response from you, maybe now or later, regarding the way in which the new African movement evolved. And throughout your explanation, you did make bold to express the way in which there was a bifurcation between what were the new African movement adherents and the Marxists. And yourself, you are a self-confessed dyed-in-the-wool Marxist, but you left out a significant figure, Alex Laguma, who also, and this goes on to my primary question, who had also made a profound impact in the landscape of South Africa. But my final question, therefore, is how is it that you are able to make such a profound delineation and successive points of trajectory of development about the New African movement? And you have made just en passant, the point about the new Negro movement. My sense that I'm getting here is you have created an ossified, almost monolithic new Negro movement, whereas there are actually tensions between, for example,
New Negro movement or New African
New
movement?
Negro,
Or New Negro, okay.
Booker T. Washington and Du Bois. Because at some point you realize, even from the writing letters that have been written, one, that have come out of Oxford, where he was actually writing to Harvard for them to confer an honorary doctorate on Booker T. Washington. That tension, similar tension between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois come up. Same applies with Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes. From outside, you think of the Harlem Renaissance as this one thing that is monolithic. Yet we know that there were fault lines there. But these were actually playing themselves out in the affiliations by South African writers like Peter Abrahams and Masilela on the other. The guidance of the elder Peter Abrahams, who's led Martin to make the Caribbean. And the steadfast belief of Masilela in African history. And I think I like the idea that you insisted on using advisedly and particularly abstract humanism as opposed to being caught up in the maelstrom of historical dialectic. But that is my question, is to perhaps is there going to be another because the first time I had the opportunity to speak, to hear you speak about these things, and you mentioned also the best interview that happened in South Africa. It was in 2003, right? We're in Zurich. You made
Yes, we're in Zurich.
Yes, we're in Zurich, 2003.
Yeah.
And I also felt like there was work that was still yet to be done.
Yeah.
Because you focused on Alexander Cromwell and the introduction of Shakespeare, but I think the tensions and how they fed on, cascaded in between the South African literary scene needs to be further explicated.
Yeah.
We need to delve into that as well, because people took positions. Like Leguan took position with Paul Robertson here, and others like Peter Abrahams took a position that aligned more with Gaddism and so forth. The blackness thing, not Pan-African thing that Masilela was advocating for. So I think we need to do more work. I don't know how we're going to facilitate that.
Okay. Thank you for that profound expression. No, I never took Alex Laguma seriously as well. No, brothers, it's not nothing better. Because we talk about sacred things in our history. Yeah, very sacred things. It doesn't mean I did not respect, I disrespected Alex Laguma. Please, we're too serious now. As I said, I'm a Marxist. It doesn't mean therefore I did not respect, that means I did not have any disrespect against Alex Laguma. But I felt Alex Laguma was communism destroyed many things in Laguma, which would have made him a great writer. And those things were very profoundly subjective. And I don't want to say that he was dogmatic, you know, it's too serious. Dogmatic is a word which has been used to push things aside, you know. But there was something, there was a profound error in Alistair Goma. Why are you laughing, my brother? but it was based on the deep crisis of the country. Right. But all of us were in a deep crisis of the country, which was to be tolerant of different views. But Alistair Goma did not have any tolerance for anybody, even I as a Marxist, in saying that only the position of Soviet communism was there. Now, I'm not criticizing Alistair Goma. I'm just stating what Alistair Goma was. Now, I'm not saying that Alistair Goma was not a decent human being. It was his reaction to apartheid with different reactions, which made him swerve to the extreme left. In my estimation, this is my estimation. Yeah. And that violent swift has its own legitimacy. I don't agree with it, but it has its own legitimacy. So for me, I cannot take Alistair Goma. I shouldn't say, I don't take him seriously. I always felt a deep sense of bitterness and anger, which really elevated him to the extreme position. And I don't want to say it's the influence of Russia, of Stalinism. I will be denigrating the intelligence of great men. You know, I don't know that it was subjective or something like that, but there was a deep anger. There's a deep, violent anger in the man, really, which young scholars have to really look at that. Then they'll really enrich ourselves, you know, about Alistair Goma. And I'm not against Alistair Goma, but there's a deep sense of anger. I'm not the left, I'm a Marxist, but there was, you know. So none of the other writers wanted to gravitate towards Alistair Goma, from what I can see. I'm not condemning him. I'm just stating the fact.
We have 15 minutes. We're at 7:30. So take maybe 3 minutes. I have just said or perhaps I'm not a mention to you. It is your turn. So take 4.
Thanks very much for this paper. And what's quite interesting is the rich genealogy that we have met, and which I think it needs to be revisited, and then we need new ways of engaging in it, and we have enabled us there. I'm thinking about the fugitive moves that...
Yes, you know what?
The fugitive moves that like... Yeah, fugitive. Fugitive, like when...
Fugitive. Oh, fugitive.
Yes. Moves that blacks have made in those times to engage in what I would call borrowed institutions, in a sense that they will want to engage in modernity, of which they are written outside of as barbarians and uncivilized, and they will need to have a particular etiquette, right? But they managing to refashion their lives in those borrowed institutions, but while they knew that their life was at stake, they can be killed at any time, and they don't have what I would refer to as ontological density, that they're not human beings, they're just gaffers, right? In the anti-black world experience. And I'm saying this because I'm thinking of the tragic times in which they were writing, they were thinking, and being proud of the legacy that they've left us with. And I'm raising this because
when one reads through the so-called South African anthologies of literary history or cultural history, these people are erased. They are not engaged as thinkers.
These people are erased.
For example, if one can look at the anthologies that came in terms of literary history of this country, including even in the visual arts, right? You don't find like artists, like black artists who have made a contribution. You just get the Gerard Scott or the few others like whom we know. But you have like even figures today, like we've been working, like I can mention even the figure, right? People who contribute so much in the country, but we don't know anything about them, right? And I'm saying this in relation to your cry that we must engage Mandela's legacy, right?
Yeah.
And if we engage in the black perspective, we are going to betray that legacy. I have a trouble with that thesis. I have a trouble with that thesis because we have been given Mandela. Mandela has been branded. 1980s, Mandela was a terrorist. 1990s, he was an icon. In fact, to critique Mandela, it's blasphemy, right? When one reads that Cambridge companion of Mandela, which came out a few years ago, you see this hesitance of taking Mandela on, because to criticize Mandela is to, it's like critiquing God. But I think we need different perspectives, and I would disagree to say we need the Black Archive because it is absent.
But there's no such thing as a Black Archive in South African history.
Of course.
How's meaning?
No, of course, I agree.
Yeah.
There's no such. There's no such in the sense that there is a violent erasure of such an archive, right? In the sense that you don't find blacks writing themselves. And like, I cannot imagine blacks not documenting anything, like posters, the personal culture of this country, the culture of letters. When I saw the 1929 letter that W.E. Du Bois wrote to Charlotte Masilela to invite her to the 1929 Tunis Pan-African Congress, which was banned by the French, right? It didn't happen. And when I saw that, I was shocked that we don't know about these things, right? But we be told about Mandela, and I'm worried that if you are told about Mandela all the time, there's no Robert Sobukwe, right? There's no Stephen Biko, right? And there's no I.B. Tabata, right? You don't find these things anywhere. And the history of Mandela that we are giving today, they will say the Sharpeville massacre that we have mentioned, right? They say Sharpeville massacre today is a human right. But whereas the Sharpeville massacre was a crash on black life, total elimination. But the historiography of Mandela that we are given in the post-1994, it says, well, let's celebrate the human rights, including the national anthem that we are having today, which is the bastardization of what Enoch Sontonga composed, right? Of what Diosoga even wrote at the time. Because like now, we're seeing it together with the stem. But when one reads, because Sigelela in its historical context, it's a hymn, right? And this hymn is not South African centric, right? But today we are forced that we must sing the stem. And then whereas we forget that the stem was a celebration of the land, the dispossession of black people. It was a dehumanization of black people. It was a justification of the central colonial apartheid apparatus. And I think the history that needs to be reconfigured today. Let's open the channel. Let's not be against the Black Archive, because like now I got scared and said, I'm willing to fight anyone.
What do you mean? I'm an old man.
No.
Just get what?
No, but it is just that today in the universities, we are.
In South Africa?
Of course.
Yeah, I don't know. I live abroad.
They are so violent. We are suffering from what they call epistemic violence, right?
At the universities?
Yes. In fact, we're not allowed even to write about our black people. You'll be told that Biko is not a philosopher. No, that's if you're saying Senghor, right? Senghor will be reduced to one sentence. Oh, negligent. But when you critique people, say, what about Negritude? They won't tell you anything. When you say Julius Nyerere, they will say, oh, Ujamaa. But when you ask them, what is Ujamaa? They don't even know. Right? In this country, there is a serious suppression of black thought. And I am glad that there is a rising voice to travel those archives, because of that. This is a time where we need a black archive more than ever. And your way, it's your work which has inspired us. Your critique of Colin Gilroy made us to reconfigure the whole debate of the Black Atlantic, because of we were falling into the trap of cosmopolitanism, which Gilroy was giving us, and it gave us another reading. So I will say that let's the cannot, yes, and it cannot be Mandela only. We need those. We need those who were erased, and it cannot be those who have written books and essays. We need even jazz musicians, people like Johnny Chad, people like Louis Morumu. They've done a lot for this country. And I think that's where the black voice will come. And maybe we can have edited anthologies and so forth. And the Black Archive is here to start, and nobody is going to stop it. Because where there's none.
Tsunamis can be stopped too. No, my brother. Can be stopped. My brother, I'm still telling you a person, I can support you. Why don't you write an essay about what you feel about the Black Archive? It's a necessity. Then some of us and all of us will jump in to that discussion. Then we have a serious discourse of altering, some people, myself, really. Because for me, something like a new African archive, it's something which covers everyone in South Africa. But since I'm older than you, I might be more preoccupied about some things of the past, which I think which we have to overcome. Whereas to you, it opens certain future spaces. So I think, I don't know what forum, we have a serious discussion. What is the meaning of an archive in a post-Mandela era? What should be its attributes? I'm very much for it. What kind of configurations it should take. Then it's not a question of theorizing now. We all have to go to the archives and look at it and sit down. So I'm not negatively opposed to the idea of Black archives. I just see there's sort of many dangers in it. But I think I could be persuaded and very much educated. When I write an essay and someone writes an essay, makes a critique, then we have a really serious discussion on the question of archives. What is the meaning of archive? What configuration? What is the historical period we should emphasize? For what reason? Who are the important figures? So on, so on. Okay. For me, immediately you say Black archives. To me, because of my history, because of who I am, I fear it's already an exclusive domain. Do you understand that? To me, which I could be wrong and illegitimate, it's already an exclusive domain. Given that South Africa, we're moving towards a totally integrated understanding of the whole country. I just, I'm an old man, and maybe that's the reason I feel that way. But really, a new African is a construct which comes from modernity and is inclusive of everyone. It does not inhibit blacks being inside it. It doesn't include gays being in it, or it doesn't include anything as it is. And the new African archive is inclusive and really profoundly, conceptually logical, given the history of South Africa. That's my reading of something like new archive. Rather than, then if you have a debate, rather than, okay, we talk about, okay, what are the specificities of the idea of an archive we're trying to engage. Where does it come from historically? What is it attempting to embrace? What is it attempting to transform? What is it attempting to articulate? You know, and I think if you, I mean, what it says to me, I don't know how we can do it. There should be a journal on the question of archives in South African history, or something like that. You know, I think it's such a fundamental question. I think when we have a debate, or even violent debates or quarrel, will give a sense of clarification to ourselves. What if you say black archives? How about the people who are not black? How does it include? How are they inclusive within the structure? Or by nature they should be excluded? Why, if so? You know, there's a debate. I mean, at a journal, I don't know where we can get money. You know, it's when you write essays. You know, because you have to think. You're not ideologized. Speaking space, that you have to go do research. You can't come and bullshit when you have to go research and get the names and say, this is what somebody said at this time, this is my thing or something like that. So I'm for really a serious debate.
No, Prof, I've done it.
He says it's done that.
Oh, you've done that?
Of course.
Why don't you share your papers with all of us?
Yeah.
No, don't say, yeah. Are you going to share the papers? Are you going to share your papers?
Of course, I can give a seminar here anytime.
No.
What I'm saying, Prof,
Wait a minute. You've already, you've already written some papers on the black archives.
Of course.
Okay, could you, I beg you, send me some, and I think the other people send it to other people too. Then what forum can we have to have a debate about this? I don't know, what forum?
Just because we have run out of time.
Okay.
We just want to give because I think it's better if they ask the questions at the same time. So you first, then we'll say so you will be the last.
So because of time, I did not want to speak, but because you give me the opportunity, let me do so. I am Sepo Muloi. I've just completed a PhD on Es'kia Mphahlele. And there's a lot of things that Professor Masilela has said here that are contrary to my findings. First of all, the issue of Mphahlele not addressing political questions is totally false. So it must be clear that Mphahlele was an ANC-affiliated member. Right from the 1940s, he gives a speech. He gave his paper in 1955 in the Freedom, where they came up with the Freedom Charter in Kliptown, and the clause on the doors of higher education shall be opened. That's Mphahlele. So we can't come here and start distorting issues of what Mphahlele did and did not do. The other issue of Pan-Africanism. Yes, Mphahlele was very close to guys like Zef Motope and a lot of Pan-Africanists. In terms of his intellectualism, yes, he was very Pan-Africanist in his writing. But no, he was never PAC, at least in a politically affiliated way. And he explains this in his, when he joined, he explains this.
Did I say he's a PAC member here?
No.
We're talking about me now. I never said that.
Yeah. So, so there's a lot that can be said. There's a lot that can be said, which was brought from his paper. But I'm going to reserve, of course, because of time. But I think what I take with immediate effect from this talk is it makes us question when we raise the issue of studying or taking interest in our black intellectuals of yesteryear. You know, if we're sitting with Professor Masilela, who inspired, like Professor Tandai is saying here, inspired a lot of us to rethink and review and reread another version of our intellectuals, away from the mainstream which are given to us in a very problematic way. And for him to come and say, you know, black archives are rubbish and it's a waste of, you know, we shouldn't be doing that. And for him to be arguing the way he's arguing is really raising a question to me to say, so now he's talking about we need to open the debate as if this debate has not long started. I don't even want to talk about fees must fall and the likes, but that was just revisiting a lot of the things that were happening, So it's a pity you have not been in South Africa for 52 years, like you said, but there's
been following what's happening at home.
Yes, but that's very true.
I know West Africa more than you do.
Okay, we're not contesting that. But I'm saying, so the long and short of it, because of time, is thank you, Prof, for your.
It's a debate.
Thank you. Yes.
Not,
like I said, I won't be able to say much because of time, but thank you for the session, and I'm sure we're going to be engaged further.
Thank you.
Professor, before you answer that, I will say it also a matter of time.
Just a small question. I think a follow-up on Professor Masimola's question. I'm struggling to square two things you said.
Yeah.
On one hand, if you talk about NEC not taking out its Laguma seriously. You mentioned, okay, you tempered it slightly. You talked about not taking out its Laguma seriously. I'm struggling to square that with what you said at the very beginning of the talk, when you said we have to be honest when we do intellectual histories, cultural and literary histories.
Yeah.
And so my struggle here is just help me with this. If you are doing an honest literary intellectual history, where is Alex Laguma's place then in that intellectual history that you're writing?
No, you definitely be a part of it, because within the New African movement, there were Marxists within it. So you would definitely be part of it. So I would not exclude him because he's a Marxist or he's a Christian or he's this, because the very heterogeneity, listen to me, brother, the heterogeneity of the people complexifies that vision of that particular historical moment. If all of us are the same, there's no uniqueness, there's no complexity. So Alex Laguma for me complexifies, the nature of a particular historical experience. I'm sorry if I sound like I'm denigrating Alex Laguma. I'm not denigrating him at all. I respected him, but I strongly disagree with his position. And that disagreement is if I can say so, it complexifies our historical experience. Rather than us being very common.
That's
Thank you. My name is Landa. I work for the ANC. I just want to ask two questions. The first one is your take on Diop.
Which Diop? Chef Diop.
Chef.
Oh, Chef Diop.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because in some ways there is a parallel between your work and his.
Oh no, there's no parallel. Not like this.
This one point, which is that when I glance in your work, when I look at some of the work that you've done.
Oh, you look at my website?
Yeah. You've done great work, painstakingly trying to retrieve and preserve African thought from the 19th century, etc. You've done wonderful work. I think it's something to be applauded. In the same way, Diop tried to protect and defend the dignity of Africans as participants in history and their contribution, for instance, in world history. Almost arguing that human civilization of efforts in Africa. So there is a similarity in those concepts of the point. I would like to hear what you take on that, because you didn't mention it in children. Secondly, I want to ask the question, is it legitimate for us, all of us here,
Is it legitimate?
for us to expect more than art from artists?
Okay.
Should artists be affected by the context in which they find themselves, or should they not? And if you say that we expect more from artists, how would we judge
But my understanding of wanting more
Should
from art,
I'm asking
I think we should want more from everybody else, not only from artists particularly, but we're talking about the instance of artists. I think we should demand from each of us the best we can do. But my understanding of wanting more from the artists is not necessarily their ideological perspective. I'm questioning. To me, you know, it's not that. It's not. I will not say therefore it's immaterial. It's secondary. Okay. Primary for me is the qualitative nature of their artisticness, which I want to be primary, to be prominent, over above their ideology. But I know that the substratum is ideology, which none of us can avoid. And if this supersedes that, I think it destroys the art. Okay, but when it's like this, it's preference. So it's unavoidable for all of us to be ideological, in a sense. But if our artistic vision or writing is predominantly, not only, but predominantly affected by ideological contestation of one kind, what the history teaches us, what we've seen from the past, it tends to be detrimental. I think all art is political. That's my humble position in that sense. But how are you political? In what context? In what form? Personally, I believe that the most important thing in art, having said that, is form. I really believe that form is the most fundamental, essential thing. And if you're very political, unintentionally, you can contort your form in contradiction to what your artistic ability is able to do within conceptual strings, that's my thing. Because ideology is unavoidable for human beings. So to struggle again. So for me, it's form. I'm always for form, really, over content. For me, as a Marxist, that's my position.
your
Yeah? Oh, Sheikh Alisho, I worship him too. I do. Because what he attempted to do about reconstructing the natural history of black people from Egypt to the present is a monumental project. You know, if I had time, I would love to write an essay about Gio. You know, I profoundly respect him. Because his thesis, fundamental thesis, or one of the fundamental thesis, to say that Egyptian civilization was black, you know, is contestable. But to me, doesn't lessen the greatness of Gio as one of our contemporary historians in many ways, in that sense. But I think any thesis, really, in a certain sense, is contestable. It cannot be definitive. No thesis is definitive for the whole of human history. It has its moment. So I profoundly respect Gio.
Colleagues, I think it's quite clear that given the provocations from the professor here, we can sit at the whole night. If I can give explanations. In many respects, some of the things he has said are quite shocking to some of us. But I think he has thrown down the conflict to the current generation of scholars to engage in this people. And I want to thank him very much. And it is the purpose of these seminars and provoke to think anew about certain things that we thought we were sure about. And I want to thank all of you. It is quite late, it's going from 8 o'clock in the evening for sitting. And I think it is largely because of you, Professor Masilela, that you are sitting here interested and you want to engage you more. It's because of the richness and the quality of your lecture today. Thank you very much. And all of you, are invited for drinks and
Yeah, thank you so much for this invitation. I think my mother, she's gone, but I think she's happy that I gave birth to a son and a daughter. But really, I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.